Welcome back, Richard. Good morning.
Morning.
Good
Yeah.
morning. I often say that I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have, but I'm especially interested in the conversation we're going to have today because this is a topic that sort of was our beginning. This was,
You and I grew up on this. It's like our Frosted Flakes or something.
yeah,
Or this is our Honey Nut Cheerios or
yeah,
Fruit Loops or something. But yeah, we grew up on this stuff.
yeah. Back in 2002, when you and I first started working together,
Mhm.
we quickly somehow gained the opportunity, reputation,
Misfortune?
misfortune, good or bad. Uh,
No, it was
um,
suddenly, yeah, the pediatricians and the psychiatrists in town knew that we had an interest and some background in this area. And at that time, back in those days, it's funny to talk about back in those days. Back in those days, very little was known about this
mhm.
group of kids, these kids. And when people found out that you and I had an interest and some knowledge, we saw several hundred of these kids, in fact, over a
Yeah,
several period. Mhm.
yeah, and so we're going to talk about kids with serious behavioral issues, and today, kind of jumping back to modern times, um, we refer to these kids as with having a diagnosis called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder.
Yeah.
But when we first started, we were talking about it. It was often referred to as early onset bipolar disorder. And so there was a lot of controversy, maybe a lot of debate and arguing about it. And so we're going to kind of walk through some of the history and some information about it, and in
Right.
particular talk about some of the differing diagnoses when we're talking about these kind of behaviors. And this is probably going to be part one of at least a two-part series,
Right.
and where we're going to get to now what do you do about it type of
Right.
things in the next podcast. But
Yeah, it was immediately apparent that we weren't going to be able to squeeze everything into a single podcast. But what started as a discussion, in fact, one of our listeners asked a question about it, and it prompted a discussion that you and I had about the new diagnosis of disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. But it's actually part of a larger issue of severe emotional dysfunction,
mhm.
dysregulation. Okay. There are kids who are severely dysregulated. They simply cannot pull themselves together, highly emotional, highly reactive. And these kids are very challenging for parents and very challenging for schools.
Right.
So we have a diagnosis as of 2013, but there's a history here that I think we want to explain because it helps to clarify the issue.
Right.
Um,
Because when we talk about dysregulation,
right,
just to be clear what that is, and that is we're referring to the inability to manage, to respond to cope with various emotions or various things that are happening in our
right.
environment.
Mm,
So, a great developmentally appropriate example of this is the terrible twos,
right.
right?
Mm,
You're going through, you have your 2-year-old, you're going through the line at the grocery store, and they ask for a candy bar, and you say, no, we're not going to have a candy bar, we're going home to have dinner, and they start having a temper tantrum.
right, right,
Okay. So that's their emotional reaction to something that happened in their environment, that limit that was being set. That's their emotional because they could, emotionally, they can't handle that denial of something that they want.
yeah,
Now, typically they get through that, but
right.
but at that stage, that type of dysregulation is developmentally appropriate.
That's right. Yeah, before the age of 18 months, I mean, I'm beginning to watch my grandchildren grow up now. Prior to about 18 months of age, children are almost totally dependent on adult caregivers to meet their needs. But by age 2, they have the developmental capacity and they begin to experiment with a range of behaviors to get their needs met. Ross Greene talks about this eloquently about kids behave to get their needs met. And one of these is a temper tantrum. It's just a try. They try that. They try a lot of things. They try single words, baba, and they ask for things. But they also behave in ways to get their needs met. It's perfectly normal, and that's why we talk about it as being age appropriate. A temper tantrum is a way to get there. If you don't get what you want, well, scream, yell, throw yourself on the floor, bang your head if you have to, stop breathing if you have to, do whatever you need to get what you want. And kids experiment with these behaviors. That's all it is. And what do we say to parents? Just ignore it, it'll go away. I like your example of the grocery store because it's a little harder to ignore your child writhing on the floor, screaming and yelling in a grocery store, but ignore it there too, because you don't want it to work in a grocery store.
Right.
So the best treatment, you ignore it. And if other shoppers are concerned, just quietly explain to them that this is a teachable moment and you're working on this with your child to ignore the temper tantrums because we want them to go away. But those are normal temper tantrums that every parent is going to deal with.
Yeah.
But about 3.5% of children experience far more than an age-appropriate temper tantrum. And that's the group that we want to talk about. And we're talking about 2, 3, 4% of kids who are going to look very, very different. And you're not dealing with a normal temper. We know about normal temper tantrums, and that's not what these kids are giving us. Okay.
Right. Yeah. You start seeing this, and you can even start seeing this at 2 years old.
You can.
It's the difference is significant. And part of the assumption that we're going to go with is that if the parent is doing the things that the parent should be doing, like ignoring the temper tantrum and those kinds of things, if the parent is doing those things and the child's tantrum continues and it lasts, for an hour. Or I had a parent share a story the other day where their young child, a little bit older than 2, but still kind of a young child, like was so upset about something, and they were trying to drive back home, reached up and took the seatbelt and tried to like wrap the seatbelt around the parent's neck, and was trying to harm the parent in that way because they were so upset. We're talking
If
about something much more serious than just those temper tantrums.
temper tantrums, right.
Typical, that's the word I was looking for, typical temper tantrums that we see in 2-year-olds.
That's right. Because a temper tantrum is simply an inappropriate or unacceptable response because you didn't get what you wanted. Okay. It's okay. An emotional meltdown, the kind of thing you're talking about, happens when somebody is experiencing severe emotional distress. I mean, and there's a difference. There's a difference between throwing yourself on the floor to demand to get something you want versus this severe emotional stress that 3 or 4% of kids seem to experience. And this is uncontrollable crying, depression, rage attacks. It manifests in many different ways. But the difference and we call these emotional meltdowns,
Right.
which is different from a temper tantrum. Okay. And it's very important to make that distinction. An emotional meltdown is more intense. I mean, there's an intensity that temper tantrums are literally child's play. Okay.
Right.
You can outlast it. These are more intense. They last longer. You walk away from a kid having a temper tantrum, it's going to stop eventually within a few seconds or a few minutes. These don't stop no matter what you do. And the recovery takes much longer. With a temper tantrum, kid throws herself on the floor, parent walks out of the room, kid says, okay, that didn't work, gets up and goes back to the parent. That doesn't happen with an emotional meltdown. The recovery takes longer. So with emotional meltdowns, we're talking differences in intensity, length, and recovery time.
Right.
Absolutely. So when you get into those, that's when we're talking about not temper tantrums, but severe emotional dysregulation.
Absolutely. So when we think about the history of this, though, we can go back to like the 1990s. There weren't a lot of ways to diagnostically identify kids with problems. And yes, in the 90s, there were kids with these problems. A lot of people will say, well, this is a new issue because kids are spoiled, kids are this and that. No,
Mhm.
these kids existed back then. These kids existed 100 years ago. There are plenty of reports of the same thing. It's just that society was different at that time.
Right.
But if you go back to the 90s, we were using the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the manual that we use to as sort of our reference tool for identifying different conditions and mental health conditions. Um, One of the best ways to define it from a diagnostic perspective was this diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder,
Right.
which basically said that, if something happens, the child explodes,
Mhm.
emotional explosion, emotional dysregulation. This child explodes and they can't really control it. And this explosion is sort of disproportionate to what was going on. And it was serious enough to cause problems in various settings and in various ways for the kid's life.
Right. When I was doing this work in Texas back in the 90s, we used a residential treatment center for a training site. And that's the diagnosis that they gave these kids who had rage attacks. They called it intermittent explosive disorder. But um, first of all, it was considered a behavior problem
Right.
back then. Okay, that the insurance industry and clinicians and everybody saw it as a behavior disorder rather than a mental health disorder, and so they wouldn't reimburse for it. You couldn't get reimbursed for this diagnosis. Then
Yeah.
in the middle 90s, 1990s, psychiatrists at Harvard and Washington University in St. Louis said, these kids kind of look like they have bipolar disorder, like there's this switch in mood. They go from kind of depressed to this very active, impulsive, angry, explosive outburst. And they said it almost looks a little bit like bipolar disorder. But the other thing that happened was adults with bipolar disorder would frequently report that
Right.
I had this when I was a teenager. I was doing this when I was a teenager. And some would say I was doing this when I was 7 or 8 years old. I can remember second, third grade, I was doing these things. And so reports from patients who said, no, no, I've always struggled with this,
Mhm.
began to suggest that maybe young people did have, young children and teens did have bipolar disorder because in before 1995, this was an adult diagnosis. You couldn't make this diagnosis in children. But bipolar disorder in children is not identical to bipolar disorder in adults. They're
Right.
very, very different. They might be similar, but it's different.
Right. Yeah. And so this idea of diagnosing the kids with bipolar disorder really got traction because of what you said a moment ago. Intermittent explosive disorder, because it was seen as a behavior disorder, it wasn't really reimbursed by insurances. And so people, when if a clinician made that diagnosis, while it may have seemed like an appropriate diagnosis, the insurance wouldn't cover it. And so either
Right.
the patient would have to pay out of pocket or the clinician just wouldn't get reimbursed for it. And
Reimbursement, right?
so bipolar disorder, on the other hand, you do get reimbursed for that. And so it makes sense that we started shifting to a diagnosis of bipolar disorder for financial reasons,
That's right.
because now you can get paid for it.
We did at the treatment center. When I first started there, I used it as a training facility for my students. It was always intermittent explosive disorder, and that's what I taught them.
Right.
In that process, through the middle 90s, it changed, and then it became bipolar disorder, and they got reimbursed. So it was
Right.
a huge shift, and part of it was financial, but part of it was clinical.
Right. And so in the early 2000s, what we started to see is we started introducing these new words like, rapid cycling and ultra rapid cycling and super duper. No, we didn't use that one, but it was like we were trying to use these words to make bipolar disorder fit because, the diagnosis of bipolar disorder requires a good amount of time that a person is in any particular mood. A manic episode, for example,
Right.
a person has
Mhm.
to be in it for about a week,
Right. Yeah.
for them to meet criteria, and kids just didn't meet that criteria, and
Yeah.
so
Kids aren't.
words like rapid cycling and ultra rapid cycling to help make it fit.
Yeah, they would say it was very confusing early on because they would say, well, no, these kids could have outbursts, emotional outbursts, 4 or 5 or 6 times a day. And
Mhm.
if you think of the outburst as a episode of mania, then it's ultra rapid cycling. That's where the
Right.
term came from. So yeah, look, maybe a little bit, but
Mhm.
not quite. And so in during the 90s, between the change in 1995 to the publication of DSM-5 in 2013, a group of researchers at NIH began a study of severe emotional dysregulation in children. It was led by a physician called by the name of Ellen Liebenluft, and she's a senior investigator, well known in this field of mood dysregulation. And her team was identified as a result of their work, identified a distinct type of emotional dysregulation
Right.
that was different from bipolar disorder and intermittent explosive disorder. So
Right.
when we studied severe emotional dysregulation, suddenly three distinct phenotypes, they're called phenotypes, three distinct types of severe emotional dysregulation in children began to emerge. And today, as clinicians, when we encounter children, when children with this severe emotional dysregulation are referred to us, our obligation is to differentiate between intermittent explosive disorder, bipolar disorder, and now disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. So we have three diagnoses, and we have to make sure that we get the right one because the correct diagnosis will lead to accurate interventions. That's why, again, we always talk about this: accurate diagnosis, better interventions.
Absolutely. And the so you have to see a clinician, a therapist or a psychologist or something who understands some of the differences, and sometimes those differences are very subtle
Right.
between some of these conditions.
Hmm.
Intermittent explosive disorder, for example, it in the DSM-5, it falls within this class of disorders called disorders of impulse control.
Hmm.
What that implies is that intermittent explosive disorder is an impulsive response.
Right.
Uh,
Hmm.
and so something happens, and there's this exaggerated, significant, highly emotional, highly behavioral response to something that's happened, something specific that's happened in the environment.
Hmm.
Sometimes, when we talk about environment, we're also talking about thoughts. Okay, so
Right.
just to be clear about that,
Hmm.
sometimes the kid may perceive that something is happening, and so it's inside their head. Um,
Right.
they may feel like somebody's doing them wrong or that somebody's trying to do
Hmm.
something bad to them, and then they react.
Right.
Anybody else around, they were like, nothing was going on. There was nothing happened, and he just
Hmm.
exploded. But it, between these explosive outbursts, the child is pretty typical.
Right.
The kid could be fun loving, could be happy, could be, any number of things. Their mood could be anything in between.
Hmm.
But when these impulsive, emotional, explosive reactions occur, they are serious, they are significant, and
Hmm.
very identifiable.
Right. Right. But people with intermittent explosive disorder they just have low tolerance for frustration
Yeah.
and adversity. They don't like argue. People argue with them, and you talk poke the bear.
Mhm.
They just have a low frustration tolerance. But except for the anger outbursts, which occur periodically, it's not like they have one every day or even every week. But when they get pushed, when they get poked, they will display these outbursts. But except for the outburst, everything else looks normal. Okay, they're reacting to frustration, but their outburst is typically very brief, not as brief as a temper tantrum, but brief,
Mhm.
and the individual returns to normal fairly quickly. Once they've exploded and they go out for a walk or they go, take a jog around the house, they sort of pull themselves back together. And so, in that regard, intermittent explosive disorder is like an exaggerated temper tantrum. It's a single event. and they return fairly quickly to a stable state. They return to normal. They just sort of lose it once in a while. Okay,
Right.
that's the way I put it. I think if you talk to my children, they would say that their father probably has intermittent explosive disorder because periodically I would lose my mind. And so, but normally I'm a nice guy. Okay. So, but every once in a while you lose it. Do you really have the diagnosis? No, but that's what it looks like.
Right.
In down in everybody's home, that's kind of what it looks like. Kids lose it. They get angry. They start screaming and yelling and everything. But the event is over and everybody goes back to normal.
Right.
Okay.
Now, bipolar disorder is different, and
Mhm.
the DSM does not differentiate bipolar disorder in adults from bipolar disorder in children. And so, to formally make that diagnosis, we'd have to use, in essence, the same criteria for kids as we do for adults.
Mhm.
And as I suggested a moment ago, there's very specific criteria for, say, a manic episode. Now, most of us
Right.
know what depression looks like, but
Mhm.
what's we could do a whole other podcast on, and we have done podcasts on what bipolar disorder is.
Right.
Technically, to meet criteria for bipolar disorder, you don't ever have to have had a depressive episode,
Right.
which is a little bit of a something that's not really fully.
Always been confusing for me.
Yeah. But so the discerning criteria for bipolar disorder is a manic episode.
Right.
To formally meet criteria for a manic episode, the symptoms associated with mania have to be present for, in the very least, we're talking about like 4 days.
That's right.
Days.
Hmm.
Four days.
Continuous. Continuous.
For four
Right.
days. And that's for hypomania. It has to be for a week unless you're hospitalized or something,
Right. Mhm.
and sedated. For a manic episode, it has to last a week. So we're talking about a long episode,
Mhm.
relatively long episode of these manic-like behaviors that have to be consistent over the course of days.
Right. Right.
And that's what meets criteria for bipolar disorder.
Mhm.
And a lot
Mhm.
of these kids don't do that.
Yeah, and that's why we frequently get children come in and they have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. But what that means for me is that I need to figure out, I need to discern what these patterns, these ups and downs, and typically kids don't stay depressed for 3 or 4 years, which
Right,
is, an adult can have a manic episode and then be depressed for 3 or 4 months. We
right,
typically don't see that in children. There's
right.
there's a Somebody's phone is ringing.
I
Is
don't
that
know.
mine?
Yeah, it's not mine. But yeah, these emotions don't last, these moods don't last in kids nearly as long as they do for adults. Now, sometimes they do in teenagers.
Hmm.
Teenagers will say, may have some of these discernible mood-related episodes that last over time, for that long. But younger kids, especially 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, they don't last that long. And outside of using some of those words that we were talking about earlier, like ultra rapid cycling, which the DSM does not specifically identify, outside of using something like that, the DSM doesn't really do anything to discern and differentiate childhood bipolar disorder from adult bipolar disorder.
Right. And I've always found it very difficult to discern these episodes, these fluctuations in mood. It's always been difficult. But as we work with families with children who have this dysregulation, if we believe it's bipolar disorder, then we have to identify these ups and downs because it helps us with intervention. I had a patient years ago, and her mother was able to track her changes, and they always occurred in July and October. So
Mhm.
this mother knew. I mean, I got a call from her every 4th of July because for some reason this child had trouble in July and October.
Right.
So we prepared for that. We knew that it was coming and we were able to deal with it. But that was very unusual to have that kind of regularity in a child.
Right. And I think another really important point before we get on to disruptive mood dysregulation disorder is that, like intermittent explosive disorder, in between these mood episodes,
Right.
the kid is pretty typical.
They're not depressed like
Right.
adults. With adults, you anticipate depression. With children, they're pretty normal
Right.
between the outbursts.
Right. And even with adults, you don't they're not constantly in one of these mood states. There's
Right.
often times when you're in this, everything is going pretty well.
Everything looks good.
It's okay. And so it's typical development and everything during that time. So um that the reason that's important, I think, to point out is because when we talk about now disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, what we're talking about is that the primary symptom is, in addition to the severe temper outbursts and things like that, is a chronic irritability that lasts most of the day, nearly every day.
Right.
And we're not necessarily talking about a specific time frame. We want it to have been at least a year or so that it's been going on. But this just is the way that the child is. It's one of the first questions that I ask parents is your child typically a happy kid, or are they like, is it always every day where you are walking on eggshells, you're being careful what you say because they are so easily agitated that it can take nothing to set them off because they're just always irritable.
That's right. So with DMDD, the red flag, the marker is irritability. These kids are angry, they're irritable, they're
All the
easy,
time.
they ignite very quickly, and they get from 0 to 60 in milliseconds. I mean, these are kids who change households. I mean,
Right.
this is a tough thing to deal with. And this is what Ellen Liebenluft at NIH, this was the one that she discovered in her research. And she said, these kids are different.
Right.
These are severe temper outbursts. I mean, they are very, but there are, and they occur 3 or more times a week. I mean,
Right.
these are things that these kids take over households. I mean,
Right.
you have to be very careful.
And the reason that they only happen three or so times a week is because the parents very quickly learn we can't we can't say the word no. We can't,
Right,
you can't do this or you can't do that because if you do, the child has almost no ability to control their emotions and
right.
not respond. And
That's
it
right.
doesn't matter what the parent does. We know
No.
parents who spank their kids. We know parents who take away everything. We know parents who have emptied kids' bedrooms and taken the door off the hinges,
Mhm.
and it doesn't change.
Mattress on the floor. Right. No, you're not going to change. Right.
We talked about temper tantrums. Kids, young kids who do temper tantrums need
Mhm.
an audience.
Right.
The temper tantrums don't happen outside of an audience. So as soon as you walk away, the temper tantrum either stops or it follows you. They're coming after you.
Mhm.
We have witnessed kids having severe outbursts related to this DMDD, severe outbursts in a parking lot by themselves.
They're alone. That's right. They're alone. They
And
just
they
leave.
are just
Mhm.
out of their mind, raging
Right.
without an audience. It didn't
Right.
matter.
Yeah, now you take intermittent explosive disorder, you provoke that kid and he'll have an outburst.
Mhm.
You don't need to provoke these kids to have an outburst or a very tiny, tiny, tiny amount of provocation. Once, hey, can you put that on the counter? You think it's a simple verbal request that you're making of your child, and it'll produce one of these very impressive, dangerous outbursts.
Yeah.
The other thing is that they have to go, these symptoms, the irritability, has to last for at least 12 months. I mean, this isn't something that just occurs and goes away like it does. Intermittent explosive disorder comes and goes. Even bipolar disorder comes and goes. This is a very consistent temperament and behavior that lasts for months.
Right.
And there's a chronicity to there. It's chronically irritable, chronically angry most of the day, most every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And it affects most areas of the kid's life. It
Right.
affects their peer relationship, it affects things at home. Sometimes, not always, sometimes it affects things at school.
Right.
The main way it affects school is school refusal. A lot
Hmm.
of times these kids somehow hold it together at school. They don't
Right.
have these rage outbursts. Um, if
Hmm.
they do, it's usually near the last quarter or so of the school year where it's like everything has been comfortable enough, and then you start really seeing that. But most of the time, when these kids have problems at school, it's because they're refusing to go, and the parent can't get them in the car, or
You
they
can't.
can't. They
and
can't.
you can't do anything about it. You know, these kids are different, and they can hold it together at school. But remember, a day has 24 hours, so they might be able to contain it for 6 or 7 hours, but the rest of the day, the other 18 hours, 15, 18 hours, are very dangerous
Right.
for other family members and for the house. So yeah, they can contain it for a time, but it's going to get unleashed almost every day,
Right.
for the rest of the day.
Right.
So when we talk about these disorders, we're talking about severe emotional dysregulation. It would appear in they're not temper tantrums. Temper tantrums are different. Um, Intermittent explosive disorder, child bipolar disorder, and disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. There are three different presentations. So if you think that your child has severe emotional dysregulation, be very careful about the diagnosis because each one requires a different intervention. And so you have to get it's very important that you get the diagnosis right. We're going to talk about that in next week. We'll talk
Right.
about how making the diagnosis, but especially we want to talk about some of the interventions you could use because these severe emotional disruptions can be very harmful
Right.
in houses and in schools, and so we need to spend some time talking about that.
Absolutely. So we will be getting at that in the next episode, and come back, and we'll be here to talk about it. All
Right.
right.
Mhm.
That's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.